some music that obviously has had African influences in Puerto Rico. It's one of the first types of music that came from the African influences of the Yoruba in Puerto Rico. It's called the bomba. Okay, so I will give you some tidbits about Afro-Puerto Rican people in Puerto Rico. The history of Puerto Ricans of African descent begins with three African men known as libertos, who accompanied the Spanish conquistadores in the invasion of the island of Puerto Rico. The Spaniards enslaved the Taino Indians, many of whom died as a result of infectious diseases brought by the Europeans. Spain's royal government needed laborers after killing off the Indian population. And you had a Catholic priest named Bartolomeo who decided that the best source of labor would be those free African men that came over with the Spanish. Thus, slavery became rampant in Puerto Rico. As a result, the majority of the African peoples who entered Puerto Rico were part of the forced migration of the Atlantic slave trade and came from many different cultures and peoples of the African continent, most of which came from Western Africa. Okay, during that period of time, after the Spanish pulled all the gold and all the resources that they could out of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean islands, they began to develop an economy based on sugar canes. And most of the plantations that were in Cuba, okay, were very large plantations as compared to the plantations that were in Puerto Rico. As a result, most of the Africans that were brought over to the Caribbean were brought to Cuba first. In Puerto Rico, slavery did not last a long time due to the fact that they had to move the supply of labor over to the larger plantations in Cuba. Okay, to this day, the Puerto Rican government has stopped reporting ethnicity in Puerto Rico. People identify themselves as Black Puerto Ricans or Afro-Puerto Ricans. And today, as a result of these changes in census, they only identify themselves as Puerto Rican. But the island, which has approximately 3.9 million people, has approximately 500,000 Black Afro-Puerto Ricans. To this day, it could be more, because what happens is many of the Dominicans that come over to Puerto Rico as a result of trying to get into the United States will stay and live in Puerto Rico, so the Black Puerto Rican population and the Dominican population is confused. Okay, so I wanted to bring up one person that I'm sure most of the people here know. Okay, a famous Black Puerto Rican. Okay, Arturo Schomburg. I know everybody's heard of that name. I'm not sure if you knew he was Puerto Rican. He was born in Santurce, Puerto Rico. Okay. Arturo Schomburg, collector and important figure of the Harlem Renaissance, was born in Santurce, Puerto Rico. His mother, a Black woman, was originally from St. Croix, Danish Virgin Islands, now the U.S. Virgin Islands. and his father was a Puerto Rican of German ancestry. Schomburg migrated to New York City in 1891. Very active in the liberation movements of Puerto Rico and Cuba, he founded Las Dos Antillas, a cultural and political group that worked for the island's independence. After the collapse of the Cuban revolutionary struggle and the cessation of Puerto Rico to the U.S., Schomburg was disillusioned and turned his attention to the African American community. In 1911, as its master, he renamed El Sol de Cuba, a lodge of Cuban and Puerto Rican immigrants, in honor of the first black Puerto Ricans in the country. The same year, he also founded the Negro Society for Historical Research. In 1922, he was elected president of the American Negro Academy. Schomburg was a vivid collector of materials on Africa and its diaspora, amassing over 10,000 documents. In 1926, his personal collection was added to the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints of the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library, and he served as curator from 1932 until his death. Today, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture of the New York Public Library is one of the foremost research centers on Africa and the diaspora. Another Puerto Rican figure that I'd like to tell you about, during that period of time, slavery, there were approximately 35 slave revolts in Puerto Rico. Although they were small and cannot be compared to what happened in the Americas, they did occur. And in 1875, the governor of Puerto Rico brought an end to slavery on the island. I would like to bring to a point the fact that the Spaniards, when they brought the Africans, free men, to Puerto Rico, had a very different attitude about blacks than the Europeans. And basically, I'm going to tell you why. The Spaniards, unlike their northern European neighbors, did not see blacks as racially inferior. Why? Perhaps the combination of geographic location, Spain's nearness to Africa, and her almost total isolation provided by the Pyrenees Mountains makes her somewhat unique as a European country. And Spain's very early exposure to peoples of color over the centuries accounts for the positive racial attitudes that were to prevail in the New World. The first blacks were brought to Spain during Arab domination by North African merchants who engaged in huge slave commerce with the peoples south of the Sahara. So basically, the blacks that were brought to Spain were given jobs. They were allowed to roam around in the cities freely, and they were known as free men. They became very useful to the Spanish in their quest to the New World. A section of the city of Seville in Spain houses many blacks, and you can see the impact of the African cultures in Spain, even though to this day Spain is considered a white European country. And they did try that in Puerto Rico also, but because there were approximately 15,000 slaves in Puerto Rico, and then they began moving them out, they had some laws in order to keep the purity of race in Puerto Rico. And they did this by moving the slaves that were in Puerto Rico to the bigger plantations, cotton plantations and sugar plantations that were in Cuba. That's one way they sought to maintain racial purity in Puerto Rico. So, I would like to speak with you about Don Pedro Albizu Campo. Okay, Don Pedro Albizu Campo was the father of Puerto Rican independence.